Some recent policy changes announced by the government that they are going to be, making some changes to beneficiaries, people who don't meet the job seeker obligations, and that's something we've talked about on this program a few times now, but some concerns that, at least some people are talking about whether or not those same obligations should be extended to people who keep having children whilst on the benefit. To what extent do we have, the government's talked about, rights and responsibilities, but is there a point where we say, hey, actually caring for people is a responsibility of any civil society, and some of how they live their life is none of our business? Actually, joining us on the program now from the Nathaniel Centre for Bioethics, Dr. John Kleinsman. Kia ora, good morning. Thanks for your time today.
Kia ora tātou, Andrew. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
It does seem ridiculous in some ways that the government should say, this is how many children you're allowed to have, and you can have more children if you earn more money. And if you have too many children, you're not entitled to benefits. But I suppose this is the logical extension of the theory which says that, hey, in order to deserve financial support from the government, you need to jump through certain lifestyle hoops, as it were.
Look, as a bioethicist, I'm particularly exercised about the question about conception and rights of conception. But I want to pick up on the later part of your introduction there, and that is how we frame the whole network or the whole framework around benefits. And, how, as a working for a Catholic Christian Bioethics Centre, how can we bring a Christian perspective to this debate? And I think the starting point has to first be, what is the narrative that we buy into around benefits? And within the Christian tradition, we regard work as a fundamental part of human existence. I think it gives us meaning. It's ultimately a good way to participate in God's act of ongoing creation. And I think I would also say part of the ongoing redemption and healing of the world. You think of those people who are in the helping roles, etc.
Yep.
So, starting point, it's good to work. Secondly, while it's not the whole purpose of life, I think the scriptures remind us that no Christian should feel that they don't have a right to work. And there's that section in 2 Thessalonians, which I'm sure you and your listeners will be very aware of. So there is, in a sense, a certain duty to work. But I think another key axiom that is critical for me is that everybody should be able to draw from work the means of providing for themselves and providing for their families, as well as serving the community.
Yeah.
And that goes back, I think, to the basic rights we all have for food, water, clothing, shelter, and we would add to that healthcare and education. So for me, this is the framework. This is a Christian framework for how we view our social welfare system. It is a function of a caring society, as you mentioned. It's not a reward for good behaviour, and it should not be a stick to beat people with, when we feel that there are people who need assistance. Let's assist them, but let's not beat them up. That's not what this is about. So fundamentally, I think social welfare is a right that people have because we have a basic right to the human necessities of life.
Just wanting to put this into a political context, I suppose, because some people may hear this and go, oh gosh, is this the new government policy? No, not at all. In the context of whether or not people should be entitled to benefits if they keep having children, this is a comment made by an ACT Party MP. It's not part of the coalition agreement. It's not tabled to be part of public policy. It's just an interesting conversation looking at the extension of some recent changes to beneficiary requirements that have come into place recently. I know, John, that there'll be people in our society, there may be people listening at the moment that their response may be, well, gosh, that's fair enough. We need to count the cost of the choices that we make. Can we afford to have more children? And there'll be people I know listening to this at the moment who've gone, you know what, we wanted to have more children, but we needed to do the maths first. If one of us was going to stop working, what would that look like? Would we still be able to make our financial obligations? Not all of our decisions, of course, to make children are financial ones, but maybe that should be part of the picture. Is that a fair comment?
Well, I think for most people it is. My concern about the particular headline, and look, I'm going to read the headline, and I'm glad you made the point that this is just a discussion at this point. And David Seymour, who was the leader of the ACT Party, has said, I want to have a conversation about this. The actual headline was, ACT pushes for harsher sanctions on beneficiaries who keep having children.
Yeah.
So that's not about people choosing for themselves. That's the state. That's the government waving a big stick and saying to certain people in our society, and they tend to be those who are least well off in lower socioeconomic brackets, that's the state saying, we don't want you to have children. Now, we've been there before.
Yeah.
We were there in the 80s with Rogernomics. We saw similar comments and heard similar rhetoric in the 90s with the Ruth Richardson debate. We heard it from the likes of Paula Bennett in 2011, this idea that we have concerns about children being born to those on welfare, and we see the access to contraception as being a barrier, particularly the cost around it. And the Prime Minister at the time endorsed the suggestion as pragmatic and common sense. But the flip side for this, and this is what I'm concerned about, is it buys into a certain narrative about who can have children and who can't. And we've been there before. And I fear this sort of that we're furthering this argument that somehow conception is something regarded as the right of the privileged for desirable groups, and those on benefits are not seen as people who are undesirable groups. Now, it might be a bit more subtle than the overt proposals for compulsory sterilisation that people will be aware of that came to the fore in the United States, in particular in the 1950s.
Yep.
But it's nonetheless part of the same logic, and the name for this is eugenics.
We have seen a different variant of this, I suppose, in parts of the world, in particular communist China, saying actually the state will decide how many children you have, and there will be significant consequences, both financial and medical, to people who flout this particular law, and China, of course, reaping the consequences of their one-child policy there. However, rather than, I suppose, go for the worst case scenario, is there a middle ground here, do you think, John? Is there perhaps a practical, a pragmatic alternative which isn't so ethically repugnant as the discussion idea being kicked around by the ACT Party at the moment?
Look, I think the first thing, to go back to a point I made before, is that we need to be aware of the particular narrative and the way we frame benefits and sanctions. So that's the first thing I think to be aware of. And yes, look, there are people who, need assistance. There are people who are living in dysfunctional relationships and dysfunctional families. They are there.
Yeah.
So if we're using the image of the hand, we want to give people a hand up. We want to get alongside people. We want to form their trust, but we don't want to use our hand to slap them down or somehow use for me is a fundamental justice right, that people have a right to food and shelter and clothing. We should not use that as a way to actually control people's lives. That for me is a sort of a fundamental principle, I guess, of social justice. And there's a certain irony, I think, Andrew, in the fact that this discussion is happening at the precise time that we are being told and told and told again that we need to get unemployment rates up.
Yeah.
Because that's the way to get inflation down, that's the way to build business confidence, that's the way to get lower mortgage rates, that's the way to actually get our economy back on track. So there's a certain irony in this for me too, that the people who are unemployed are bearing a disproportionate amount of the pain, if you like, for getting our country back on track.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, we're ready to victimise them and say to them, well, somehow you are a different class of people. You don't have the same rights as other people. That's where my concern comes through about this whole discussion.
There will be some people, I suppose, who are thinking, well, gosh, if only we had the time to have more children, that actually people who have spent their time building a career, perhaps doing some professional or academic study, perhaps they've got a huge mortgage, all those sorts of things, perhaps in a space where they wish they had the time or the opportunity to have more children than they do. But I suppose those individuals also had a choice. Having that dictated by the government, these people should have children, these people shouldn't, that's where it starts to get a bit, sounding a bit Nazi, if I can use that term.
Well, that's not necessarily a word I would use, but it certainly crosses an ethical line for me. And look, again, there's another further irony in the fact that in the last couple of weeks, there's also been significant discussion and quite a bit of writing around what is currently being termed as the fertility drought in New Zealand.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, people are talking about the fact we haven't got enough children. And on the other hand, we're talking about people or the state saying, well, we're going to sanction people who, if you want to have children on the benefit. There's an irony and there's an inconsistency in that as well. And for me, there's a bit of a gap in the government's rhetoric, I think. If you listen to the policy announcement that was made by our Prime Minister and by Louise Upston, the Minister, there was some good stuff in that about, helping people, the importance of workers, about giving people dignity, all of those things that as Christians we would believe. And yet there's a disconnect then between the language they then go on to talk about and the way in which they're going to enact these policies. So for me, it's about a consistent ethic of life as well.
Is it good to be having the conversation? Because, to be fair, ACT is basically saying, hey, here's a topic to kick around. Is it good to be having the conversation? We probably wouldn't be chatting about this unless that headline had happened. Or is this, hey, let's talk euthanasia and now suddenly it's law? Is this the beginning of perhaps a political direction that they're looking to head into?
No, I don't necessarily think that is the case, but there are these underlying attitudes and values and prejudices and narratives which we're not always necessarily aware of. One of the questions that I would ask is whether, in fact, this is the comeback of eugenics. And my point as a bioethicist would be to say that, in fact, I think this way of thinking has never, ever really left us. It lurks there below the surface, and it comes to the surface at times when we start talking about sanctions and policies that, in fact, are targeted at a particular group of people who happen to be those who are, if you like, unlucky enough to be in a position of being unemployed. So I think it's a current, it's a prejudice that is always there, and I think it's really, really healthy that we, in fact, bring it up and have that conversation, and that hopefully people will think, oh gosh, I hadn't really thought about that. So it's taking that step backward and looking at what is the broad framework, what is the narrative behind all of this.
Good to be, I suppose, thinking through the consequences of some of these complicated ethical decisions and what that might look like politically. John, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us today.
Andrew, you're very welcome.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.